Good afternoon. Last time we had a conversation, we talked about the spread of the Cotton Kingdom in South Carolina, which changed the demographics of the state considerably. So that by 1860, all but 10 of the state's 46 districts or parishes had a black majority. And all of that was going to factor into South Carolina's relationship with the federal government, with the Union. South Carolina had helped create the U.S. Constitution. The attitudes of the low country elite, the planters, the largest slaveholders, was very much in favor of it. The backcountry was opposed to it for a number of reasons. They said it was remote, a powerful federal government would regulate trade and commerce, and a federal government could cut off the slave trade, because already ambitious young politicians from the backcountry were thinking about acquiring slaves and becoming planters themselves. Eventually, the backcountry attitudes would become South Carolina attitudes, but that would take several generations. From the signing of the Constitution until through the War of 1812, there was rising nationalism in the country and in South Carolina. There was also the rise of Jeffersonianism, which promoted a states' rights or strict construction of the Constitution. In the backcountry, although it was certainly Jeffersonian, the rising planter class, for example, good example was Wade Hampton I, took Thomas Jefferson literally from his inaugural address. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. The War of 1812 was declared, led by John C. Calhoun and Langdon Cheves from Charleston, who happened to be Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. They were called the War Hawks. They wanted war with Great Britain. For many reasons, British impact on American trade. Some of them had, particularly like another war hawk, Henry Clay, had designs on Canada. But anyway, the War of 1812, no matter how it turned out actually pretty well with the Battle of New Orleans, but before that it was pretty bad, unleashed a tide of nationalism and what was called the era of good feelings. Congress passed something called the Tariff of 1816 to protect the infant industries, primarily of the Northeast. They created the Second Bank of the United States to manage currency. And the nation went on an internal improvements binge, mostly funded by the federal government. This was building roads, canals, improving harbors, building fortifications from New England all the way down to New Orleans to protect American cities from what had happened during the War of 1812. Economic prosperity returned after the war. John C. Calhoun and others supported internal improvements nationally and within South Carolina. In South Carolina, we went on a canal building binge and a road building binge. And the reason that Calhoun and other South Carolina politicians supported it in the years after the War of 1812, because they thought being a member of the Union was beneficial to South Carolina. Then came the economic panic of 1819. It ended the first cotton boom with a crash, and I do mean with a crash. The bottom dropped out of the cotton market. Had tremendous ramifications in South Carolina. First of all was the exodus of population from South Carolina to the more agriculturally beneficial states of the old Southwest: Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Upper Louisiana. Eventually would go into West Tennessee and Arkansas. The suspicion of northern commercial interests and the economic competition that South Carolina faced from those states of the lower South, because the land was so much better. They could produce more cotton more cheaply than South Carolina. And the fluctuation of world commodity prices of rice and cotton all went down. And then there were challenges to the safety and security, the harmony of South Carolina. The Missouri Compromise debate in 1819 and 1820. The idea was, since the country had been created under the new Constitution, there would be an equal number of slave states and an equal number of free states represented in the United States Senate. Well, Missouri wanted to come in as a slave state, but there wasn't a free state or area ready to come in, except, guess what, Massachusetts still controlled what we now know as the state of Maine. And so it was fixed that Maine would come in as a free state and Massachusetts as a slave state, Missouri as a slave state. And they would draw a line across the country at the 36th parallel, and above that line, slavery would be forever prohibited. Below that line, the territory would be open to slavery. South Carolina's Charles Pinckney, who was the only founding father of the country in Congress, said it was never the intent of the Constitution Convention to allow Congress to interfere with the institution of slavery. But he was a minority voice even within the South Carolina delegation. John C. Calhoun persuaded President Monroe that the compromise was legal and he should sign it. The same time that this debate over control of slavery at the national level, the 1820 census showed South Carolina once again had had a black majority. From 1708 until 1790, it had had a black majority, then briefly an influx of population, particularly in the backcountry. Those good Scots-Irish coming down created a white majority, and then with an exodus of white planters and a tremendous increase in the slave population, South Carolina was once again a black majority state. And this black majority would increase until in 1860, South Carolina was virtually 60% African American. And at the same time, you've got the Denmark-Vesey plot in Charleston. Vesey, a leader, a free person of color, was a leader in the black African Methodist Episcopal Church. And he liked to preach on, from the Old Testament, on Exodus, let my people go. The plot was betrayed in May 1822, and eventually, after an investigation by special committees, by local authorities, charges were brought against 117 black Carolinians before a special tribunal. 35 were sentenced to death, 37 were sold out of state, the rest were acquitted. Vesey went to the gallows maintaining his innocence. Some whites agreed, and William Johnson, who was a South Carolinian and an associate justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, wrote an anonymous pamphlet which he had to retract because he said there was no plot, it was simply hysteria. Was there a plot? Or was it designed to strike, was it a plot not by the slaves but by the white minority to put the fear into slaves? Historians are still debating that question. But there was an aftermath. The AME church was demolished, closed and demolished, and of course that congregation would later, after the Civil War, rise up as what we now know as Mother Emanuel. And in 1822 and 23, our General Assembly passed what was called the Seamen's Act. A free person of color who came into the port on an English ship or a ship out of New England could not get off the ship in Charleston Harbor. If he did, he would be jailed, and the captain would have to pay for the room and the board. This violated the United States Constitution and treaties, but South Carolina didn't really care. Over the next 10 years, a series of events in the country concerning slavery threatened to undermine the order and harmony of South Carolina, including, off in Virginia, the Nat Turner Rebellion. And so South Carolina is beginning to question its place in the Union. The origins of what we call the nullification controversy of the 1830s. white Carolinians were becoming increasingly uneasy and unhappy. They blamed the tariff, the federal government for their problems. One wag who opposed nullification said, you may nullify the tariffs, but you cannot nullify the soils of Alabama and Mississippi. Gentlemen, that's your real problem. Well, that was true, but nobody wanted to hear that. So with the federal government and the tariffs that had been imposed, not just in 1816, but increasingly in the 1820s, South Carolinians began to chafe at being one of the states of the United States. In fact, initially, Calhoun wasn't part of that nullification movement, but he got burned in the press, so did his followers, particularly for their support of the Missouri Compromise. If Congress could stretch the Constitution and do the tariffs, were there no limits? Could Congress drew that line in Missouri? Could they abolish slavery? By the late 1820s, the state's newspapers and politicians were denouncing tariffs and any discussion at the national level of slavery as a threat to South Carolina. The tariff of 1824 raised rates, it upset folks, but not so much as what was called the Tariff of Abominations in 1828. It had been promoted by Andrew Jackson's friends, including Calhoun, interestingly enough, to increase import duties 30 to 50%. The idea that it was going to be so outrageous that it wouldn't pass Congress, but then people could go home and say, look what we tried to do. I mean, Congress still does that kind of thing. But it was to promote Andrew Jackson's presidency. Calhoun had presidential ambitions and was embarrassed by the radicalism of his fellow South Carolinians. Well, there were candidates for president. Andrew Jackson in 1824, William Henry Crawford of Georgia, Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and Calhoun. Calhoun backed out and said he would run for vice president, so he was elected in 1828. And he ran again in 1828 for vice president and was reelected this time with with Andrew Jackson as president. In the meantime, Calhoun had authored a document, South Carolina Exposition and Protest. And in it, he said, certain powers expressly delegated to the national government, the rest were reserved to the states, and sovereignty rested with the people of the several states. Now, this is how nullification was supposed to work. And the doctrine is drawn from the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of the 1790s. But the actual process of nullification of federal law began in South Carolina. It was supposed to begin with the Convention of the People. Now, we can go back to conventions of the people making a difference back to 1719 when the colonists overthrew the Lords Proprietors. So there's a traditional, that's not just a tradition, there is precedent for this in South Carolina. The General Assembly got the document, printed 5,000 copies of it. It was supposed to be anonymous, but everybody knew who it was. None of this helped the relationship of the vice president with the president. And there were some other issues involved here. One was the wife of the Secretary of War, Mrs. Eaton, who was a former barmaid, that's to put it nicely, and she was the wife of the Secretary of War. Well, Calhoun was a widow, Jackson was a widow, so there was no official first lady, but Mrs. John C. Calhoun, as the wife of the vice president, was the ranking grande dame in the capital city. And she refused to entertain or to allow Mrs. Eaton in her home and put out the word, ladies, we don't mix with folks like that. Well, Andrew Jackson was very sensitive about people saying ugly things about women. he felt that his wife Rachel had been killed by the horrible rumors that circulated during the presidential campaign about her. And he ordered Calhoun to tell his wife that she had to receive Mrs. Eaton. Well, Mrs. Calhoun said not only no, but heck no, packed her bags, left Washington, and never returned. And then, more importantly, there was the question of somebody tried to court-martial, or wanted Andrew Jackson court-martialed when he took an army into Florida, looted Pensacola, hanged 2 British citizens. And the word had always been it was Secretary of State John Quincy Adams. This was in 1819. Well, no, it wasn't. It was Secretary of War John C. Calhoun. And another one of Jackson's favorites, Martin Van Buren of New York, started going through the minutes of the cabinet meetings and, wow, look what I found. And he shows it to President Jackson, who calls Calhoun in. Well, and said, is this what happened? Well, Calhoun began to tap dance and basically lie to Jackson. Not a smart move. And then in Congress are the great Webster-Hayne debates. Senator Hayne of South Carolina, Senator Webster from Massachusetts, debating the nature of the Union. So all of this is going on, and in April 1830 is the annual Jefferson Day dinner. And this was a turning point. As president and presiding officer, a senior VIP at the dinner, Andrew Jackson stood up and said, "Our Union, it must be preserved." John C. Calhoun, the vice president, responded in toasts, "The Union next to our liberties most dear." And there are people who observed that meeting who said, Calhoun held the stem of his wine glass so tightly that it almost broke. And this is a public rupture between the vice president and the president, both of whom are Scots-Irish from South Carolina originally. South Carolina is divided into 2 camps back home. The Unionists who believe in the federal union, led by James L. Pettigrew, Joel R. Poinsett, William J. Grayson. These are older statesmen and leaders. The nullifiers, Robert J. Turnbull, Robert Barnwell Rhett, Francis W. Pickens, newer men, and as the older men said, on the make. Calhoun was being forced to take a stand, something he really didn't want to do. But in the summer of 1831, he came out for nullification. The elections for the 1832 General Assembly would decide the issues. Nasty. Unionists were called submissionists. The radicals, the nullifiers, were called Jacobins after the crazy mob in the French Revolution. It was dirty. Gangs of toughs on both sides interrupted speeches, threw rocks, rotten eggs. Benjamin Perry from Greenville, a Unionist, killed the editor of the local newspaper up there in a duel. Governor James Hamilton used the militia musters as nullification rallies. And when the votes were cast, the nullifiers won almost 60% of the vote, 100 of 124 seats in the House, and 34 of 45 Senate seats. Interestingly, though, a change of just 67 votes in the city of Charleston would have given the Unionists enough seats to block the 2/3 vote necessary to call a nullification convention. So the General Assembly calls for an election to a nullification convention. It met in Columbia in November 1832 and declared the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 null, void, and no law, nor binding upon this state, its officers, or its citizens. And they set a February 1st, 1833 deadline. You notice they didn't do this immediately. They put a breathing period in there. They didn't expect Jackson to react. He hadn't done anything about the Seamen's Act. He had let the Cherokee lands be taken in Georgia. But in December, Jackson issued a proclamation on nullification that stunned his native state. His declaration that secession by force was treason. White South Carolinians rallied, even those who opposed nullification. The Unionists and the upstate were actually negotiating with Jackson for arms, a real threat of civil war. And now we come to the first of, or rather the second of great compromises in the pre-Civil War America, the Compromise of 1833. Because of his rift with Andrew Jackson, Calhoun had resigned from the Senate, and since the General Assembly elects a senator, there was a resignation, and Calhoun was elected to the United States Senate. And with Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, a compromise was worked out. The tariffs would be reduced gradually to the 1816 level, but a part of the compromise was the Force Act, which said that the president had the authority to use the Army and the Navy to enforce the laws of the land, including tariffs. Now, Calhoun and some other senators abstained, but there were enough votes to carry it. The Nullification Convention reconvened, repealed nullification, but nullified the Force Act. Now, today we always like to have winners and losers in any political situation. Winners, Andrew Jackson. He, in essence, stood up and said, the Union, it must be preserved. Calhoun solidified his political base, and that's on the national level, but that did not, his role did not help him in his national ambitions. Back home in South Carolina, the Unionists were hounded from office. There was a test oath that you had to support South Carolina first before the federal Constitution. When the State Court of Appeals ruled that was unconstitutional, the General Assembly abolished the State Court of Appeals. And there was a general suppression of dissent. And the far most radical group who really did want to secede in 1832-33 lost because they could not disrupt the Union. And South Carolina acquired the reputation for rashness and hot-headedness, and the rest of the American South tried to keep a distance. They just held South Carolina at arm's length. This is when many referred to South Carolina as the Hotspur State. And I know you all know who Hotspur was. I'm sorry to say that by the last 10 years I was teaching at Carolina, undergraduates didn't know who Henry Hotspur was from Shakespeare. But that gives you an idea of where the state stood with regard to the rest of the country. And South Carolina became a one-party state. Calhoun believed he needed a united South Carolina in order to become the state's leading defender. They were nominally Democrats, but within the state there were no party labels up through the Civil War in South Carolina. By 1840, he forced the nullifiers to accept Unionist candidates, and a majority of the voters clearly supported it was time to let bygones be bygones and come back together. The General Assembly still controlled South Carolina politics, and planters controlled the General Assembly. A majority of the General Assembly, 80%, were slaveholders. No other southern state had a majority of planters or such a high percentage of slaveholders. South Carolina whites united because of increased agitation over slavery. Regardless of whether Unionist or nullifier, white South Carolinians defended the institution. And there was a political correctness not witnessed even in 20th century or even 21st century South Carolina. Outside critics, including native daughters, the Grimke sisters, who went north, became more vocal. And after 1837, white Southerners, and not just South Carolinians, followed Calhoun's lead and no longer apologized for slavery. Now, there is more to this story, and I'm going to continue that story of South Carolina's relationship with the Union next week in further conversation.